Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here and I'm back with a new video, which is going to be the Game Week 16 cheat sheet. One game week left until the World Cup. I'll definitely be covering the World Cup fantasy videos. It's just a passion of mine, international football. Nothing specifically to really say about the location. Unfortunately, I think Jurgen Klopp put it best when he said, what we could have done maybe a decade ago. And unfortunately, it's gotten to the point where we have to play the World Cup in Qatar. And I will be covering it as well from a World Cup fantasy point of view. Regardless, anyways, looking at the video today, we have Game Week 16. The whole point here is to maximize on this game week specifically. So just looking idealistically in these fixtures here, looking at, let's say, the EFL Cup, the impacts there, not too huge in my opinion. We did see a little bit of rest and rotation from Man City. Otherwise, there were a couple shocks, but mostly the players that we'd like to target this week were rested or at least have joined back their starting 11. So that's quite interesting when we look about the overall scope of what transfers we should look into. Andreas is still a top option in the budget area. Nothing really to say there. He's just not worth a transfer out. He might be interesting to play as your first bench. We've seen Andreas actually do tremendously well, even be the penalty taker versus City, so he clearly easily should be the first option on the bench, even though I don't really expect him to do much versus United. I can see why players might play him, but I'm not really going to bank on him getting a penalty as well this week, so I do think he should sit on our benches. Almiron clearly is still a top option. We don't know exactly the nature of his injury. I think Almiron is going to be a player that we definitely will slam into our teams after the World Cup, but specifically to target that Chelsea match, if you don't have Almiron already, I'd probably be a little bit more interested in going for some of the options from Crystal Palace or even a Billing or a Gibbs White, something a little bit more differential, players who are still kind of key players for their teams. When you look at, for example, the scope of this kind of 5.0, 5.9 landscape, what's tough is the Everton mids is very hard to pick between them, so therefore I would probably skip them even though they have a great game. On the other hand, we know that Billing has been an absolute talisman alongside Solanke, playing that 4-4-2 formation. Tavernier obviously is a very, very pronounced right back who's doing a lot of things for them. He is simply involved in a lot of plays, and I think Billing is quite a good punt, specifically because this Everton team aren't really in the best of form. On top of that, Eze and Elise have great matchups themselves. Elise is someone who actually enters the box a little bit more, but there is going to be that possibility that he plays less minutes, and Eze is someone who is a little bit more creative, a little bit more assistive, but you get more guarantees there from the minutes that he's going to play, and we still see Eze as a very involved midfielder. Elise might just be the better punt for Game Week 16 because you're dead ending here. You don't really have to worry about his injury concerns or his minute concerns rather, and therefore I think he might be the best punt in this category if you don't already have Almiron and you're just looking for this one game week to maximize. At the same time, I think Benrahma is equally in a great situation. He is someone that Fabio Borges actually brought in last week, the miracle man himself. And I do think Benrahma is someone who's stepping into form. You can actually see his underlying stats have increased as of late. And Bowen is someone who is still at the top when it comes to expected goal involvement along his peers. But when you look at a per 90 basis, I don't think Bowen is necessarily worth the amount of money he costs. And a lot of us owners will be feeling the exact same thing with owning Foden and so on and so forth. So I do think Benrahma is one of those players that you could step into who's actually in form right now and probably worth the transfer. The same way I would say Gross and McAllister are interesting options. One of the issues that I find with Brighton is that a lot of people can get involved. If you're actually looking at the way that they play football, a lot of people are getting onto the ends of things, specifically people playing wing-back positions as well. So there's a lot of dynamicism within this team, and I wouldn't really argue that there's a talisman. If you look at their goals, for example, in the EFL Cup game, it's very clear that a lot of players would get different chances per game. Even when I was looking at the underlying stats in the previous games under De Zerbi, there's no clear option that really strikes out as the best, with exception to Trossard, who's a little bit more expensive. And so in this territory, you could even go for crazy punts like Mitoma for now, but it's very, very hard to pick between all these options. So maybe I would still sidestep a Brighton option. I just think there's a little bit more gunpowder from options like a Benrahma, like an Elise, or even a Billing for now. As far as Gibbs White, we actually predicted him to have a good week in these next 2 weeks. Going back to Game Week 15, he was actually inserted into the cheat sheet then. He obviously had a fantastic performance versus Brentford. And I'm expecting more of the same, really, because this Crystal Palace team haven't been an exclusively good defense, exceptionally good defense, sorry. And at the same time, I do think some other players have better matchups here, but Gibbs White is clearly stepping into good form. And that's a nice positive sign to think about because we have so much diversity in this position. Moving into 6.0 to 6.9, I have risen Martinelli back to the top. It just simply is the scenario where it is worth separating Martinelli and Odegaard as options, especially now that Saka's back. I still think Saka's the second best option from Arsenal. Jesus probably the third, and then Martinelli clearly the best for me still when we're talking about attacking players. But Arsenal, you do deserve a transfer, or the transfers towards their defenders are actually much more deserved in my opinion. I think you should at least have someone like a Gabriel or a Saliba in the future. Obviously, I'm someone who hasn't really employed either of these players in my team, and I am regretting it because I did start the season with Ramsdale, and I pivoted away from Ramsdale to much of my regret. And Saliba and Gabriel actually are still great options for thinking about the overall scope of the Arsenal landscape. I think a lot of us only have 2 Arsenal players. So if you're interested in going for another one, I wouldn't really move into Odegaard immediately. I'd probably still look at a punt of maybe someone like Jesus, that a lot of people and a lot of us have moved out of in recent weeks, or just simply invest in an Arsenal defender who still has great dividends versus this Wolves team who haven't shown much recently, to be honest, with the exception to that kind of performance versus Brighton in the first half. With the second half of the midfielders, what I would say Zaha it does appear as one of the top options this week. We saw him as a clearly talismanic player in the West Ham game, someone who managed to get a great goal without actually getting penalties. And that is a little bit more interesting when he gets to play Nottingham Forest, because even though he's away from home, once again, we have a situation where this Nottingham Forest team is second when it comes to penalties given away. I do think they have a lot of technical players. We talked about how Elise gets into the box, and Zaha is someone who's going to benefit in a penalty situation. Not to mention that Nottingham Forest have simply been letting so much XG go, even though they've had good results when it comes to goal scoring as of late. I still think there's plenty of chances for Crystal Palace to find versus this team. And therefore, Zaha seems to appear to me as the best option this week as a single transfer, because he has the guarantees that other players don't have. For example, Foden is someone who I've dropped, whereas Saka is someone who I've risen, because I have more guarantees over Saka's minutes. Yes, you could obviously argue that EFL Cup games do dictate how Pep is going to rotate, and Foden clearly was not present there, but Alvarez had a great performance, Mahrez even as well. And you could even argue that there might be a little bit of an element of Pep not really finding Foden to his liking as of late, because he's had multiple benchings, and Foden hasn't really gotten the minutes that we would have expected. Early in the season, we were actually seeing that Foden started almost every game and played around 45, 60 minutes at the very bare minimum. Now we're seeing Foden play 20 to 30 minutes, so there could be a change in expectations there from Pep that we need to kind of account for, even though I think a lot of us are projecting him to start. So that's kind of why I've dropped him this week. I still think it's a little bit of a risk, whereas Zaha seems to be kind of a surefire bet versus a Nottingham Forest team, and that's just my opinion. 10 plus players have added Fernandes as a 1 week punt. He's very interesting. I do think Rashford is actually still the best Man United player to go for. We'll talk about an Anthony Martial as well in the forward position later. But if I was to punt for this United team, because I do think this Fulham team are quite capable of scoring and United are capable of losing that clean sheet, specifically with how the defense have sort of stagnated a little bit with the Bryan injury, I would say definitely Fernandes is an interesting punt from the attacking point of view, but only if it really suits the kind of scenario of your team. Let's say if you're someone who's been bored of Sterling, or for some reason doesn't have the funds to really go into De Bruyne or Salah, because I still think that they're better options ultimately, and that's going to be the state of the midfield. In terms of the forward positions, what we have here is a little bit of a change where Solanke rises back to the absolute top. At the same time, we have Martial here appearing as a top option. And what I would like to raise about Martial as a point is, we all thought he was going to be a great punt maybe 2 to 3 weeks ago, or maybe 4 to 5 weeks ago actually, when he was set to play, actually got involved in the Everton game, scored a goal even, and then actually was injured. One of the situations that we have Martial is, you're looking at a Game Week 16 game, a 1 game week punt. I do think he's an exceptional punt in this area, specifically people who've moved into Alvarez last week, and now Alvarez is not really an option if we expect him to not start. At the same time, though, I have to say, at this price range, I still think Alvarez is the absolute best player. He's not featured in the cheat sheet here because I think he's very conditional. So this really is something that just rewards people who actually listen to the video. I'm sure I'll get a comment about it anyways. But Solanke for me is a top option in terms of security. But Martial and Alvarez are definitely the spears. Martial had a great game in the EFL Cup, and I think we're going to expect him to start again. He is clearly the more preferred striker when it comes to Cristiano Ronaldo versus Martial, which is why also maybe Ronaldo should actually have, I think in retrospect, been moved to an avoid position. I would not invest into Ronaldo this week. However, Martial for me is still someone that I'm not sure if I want to put that kind of 1 game week bet into. I still think Alvarez is the best option if you can get him starting. And then I'd probably still go with Solanke over Martial, just because the game is actually fantastic for Solanke. We've still seen that Bournemouth have created a considerable amount of chances lately. Yes, Solanke has overscored his XG a lot, and he's been quite lucky, I suppose, to even get these goal-scoring chances. But when we look at Anthony Martial, I think the variables around him, it's not really that worth the risk when we have such a safe and solid option like Solanke. As far as 7.0 to 7.9 options, the reason why I've kept Wilson as a top-tier option, even though I have a slight asterisk around him, is simply because he's been in fantastic form. This Newcastle team are clearly overperforming when it comes to their recent result versus Southampton, but at the same time, we can see it. The underlying stats still support that they're a top 4 team when it comes to both attack and defense. And I really think if you look at the results as of late as well, they all really came from Wilson coming back away from injury. Yes, of course, a lot of goals were scored when Chris Wood came in as well last week, so it's clearly not just a kind of Callum Wilson thing. It's more of a overall team cohesion thing, having Bruno back in midfield too. However, I still think he's a great punt. This Chelsea team have really let a lot of chances slip. I think Arsenal were actually a little bit unfortunate to not get more chances. You have Newcastle playing at home as well, which is a huge difference to actually playing at Stamford Bridge. And yeah, I still think Wilson's a great punt. Someone that I would still keep in my team. I know there's a lot of frustration there for a lot of managers, but he's someone I would still love to stick to this week. Jesus rises as a top option. We talked about Darwin, Haaland, and Kane. I really don't think there's much to really talk about. But the reason why Jesus does rise is because this Wolves team have simply given a lot of chances away to many teams. We got a red card situation was last week. I do think that there's no real cohesion there. They're still clearly in dire straits when it comes to actually finding a permanent manager. Lopetegui, of course, doesn't seem to be that close to the club right now because of his situation at home. And this is a great time for Arsenal to strike. These Arsenal players have all been selected into the national team. One last chance to provide a great performance versus the World Cup. That's going to be the narrative I'm going with. I hope Jesus will break his kind of terrible kind of finishing streak for a bit and have an opportunity here to do well away from home versus Wolves. I think factoring Arsenal away from home, you have to see that they've had great performances away. I would say Jesus versus Brentford is a prime example of that, and I wouldn't really be sidestepping the Jesus transfer unless you have better plans in mind, such as getting Haaland back into your team, which is definitely something I'm thinking about myself. But beyond that, I think Jesus and Darwin are definitely probably the two best punts this week if you're looking to invest into a little bit more of an expensive forward, specifically if you're a Calvert-Lewin owner who unfortunately has had to deal with the situation of his injury, which I am myself. In terms of the defensive positions, I think the one change here is really Sessegnon and what to think about Perisic. So Sessegnon is someone who did play in the cup match. He was substituted off early. I think Conte said that he was dealing with some issues. And there's a likelihood, of course, that Perisic might just start in the left wing back position. But the reason why Perisic is just much more appealing than him as a game week punt is because Perisic can either play in that kind of attacking position that he played in the previous match, alongside, let's say, a Kane and a Kulusevski, or he could simply slot back into left wing back. So I don't really see Sessegnon as someone to go for this week. He's a clear avoid. At the same time, Guehi and Anderson rise towards the top because that single pure matchup versus Nottingham Forest is very interesting. One thing I will say about Nottingham Forest and Bournemouth is that these two games away from home, you still have this Bournemouth and Nottingham Forest team that are right now finding a little bit of form, specifically the Nottingham Forest team when it comes to actually their goal scoring chances. We saw them quite comfortably beat the Tottenham team playing a almost first string team. And I think they'll carry that form towards Crystal Palace, so I don't really see Crystal Palace keeping a clean sheet. On the other hand, I much like Ben White and Duncan Webster as options when you're looking for clean sheets. Shaw still has a little bit of an attacking edge towards him, and I think that therefore that's the value in Shaw. And then with Zouma and Cresswell, probably once again a chance to get a clean sheet. We know West Ham are very capable of doing that at home. They weren't able to do that versus Crystal Palace last week, but I think you give them the benefit of doubt because we've seen Leicester, for example, also struggle to actually score in some games. For example, like the Crystal Palace game in recent memory. At the same time, I will say that Leicester, of course, are a little bit of a spear because they've been able to actually outscore some of their underlying chances, and they do have these quality players that can score from ridiculous chances like a Yuri Tillemans. But as things stand, I really think the best punts are still Arsenal and Wolves when it comes to clean sheets. You have obviously Gabriel and Saliba, who represent Arsenal once again in the 5.0, 5.4 positions. But if you're looking really for a one-game week punt, I do think Perisic is probably one of the best punts. If you have a little bit more money, then I'd probably extend that towards Robertson, because Perisic still played a lot of minutes in the EFL Cup game. Meanwhile, this Liverpool team mostly got some considerable rest, and they are playing Southampton. They're also finally, I would dare say, are in form. And Salah, of course, is someone who has been connecting as well in the attacking point of view. Trent slotting a little bit further back, and Robertson actually attacking a little bit more when you're looking at the heat maps. Whether you actually want to take that into account, because Trent can obviously score and get points in a multitude of ways, is up to you. But I do think Robertson has a little bit of an attacking edge this week, and he might be an interesting punt if you're just looking for a very, very solid differential who has a little bit more of an appeal than just purely goal scoring from a set piece like a Van Dijk. And that's going to be the defenders this week. When it comes to the goalkeepers, there's nothing really that I would like to add when it compares to the defenders. I think we talked about the matchups as well, all in isolation. Ramsdale, of course, appears as a top option this week specifically because of the Wolves game. And White, of course, appears as a new option to really consider if you're actually looking towards a goalkeeper transfer. I think some people do actually have the capacity to, let's say, move away from Nick Pope because he's playing versus Chelsea. And I think the best option, of course, is to move simply towards an upgrade with Ederson, especially now that we probably have only 2 City players in our team. If you don't have that capability, then, of course, I think Ramsdale is a very, very solid option as well. And if you don't have that, then I think I'd probably still actually pick Sanchez versus Aston Villa, which I think is probably the most tempting game when it comes to getting a clean sheet this week. And that's going to be the cheat sheet this week. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the team selection video.